Path of the Pole by Charles Hapgood, Part 8. You are listening to Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Oh, I love this beautiful, new, sexy room. I just want to be in here all the time.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, angels and demons and monsters and serpents. This is Brothers of the Serpent podcast, and we are coming to you not live from a brand new and totally revamped 10 by 10 by 10 tangent cube of science, where we are nestled amongst the dusty bones of an ancient seabed high atop the Edwards Plateau. So Kyle and Laura spent the last, 4 or 5 days?
Yeah. All the way through the holidays, pretty much, this last week. I think we did the last show. When did we do the last show? Tuesday?
Wednesday?
Yeah. Really? Yeah, it's been since then.
Maybe it was Tuesday.
I don't even remember.
I think it was Wednesday.
But yeah, after we finished that show, I basically just ripped everything out of here.
Yeah.
And then Laura repainted it. I bought lumber. I bought carpet. Laura went carpet shopping for me.
Yeah. Carpet looks great.
And, yeah.
The old cigarette smell is gone.
It's completely gone.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal.
Both of us have quit smoking cigarettes for a while now, but it still smelled like cigarettes in here from the years of beers and smokes technologies and the rock and roll.
And now the vapes they smell good. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's great. I made smaller shelves so we have a lot more room.
Yes.
I mean, this is both podcasts for video and also redoing it for the music.
There's so much more room in here.
Yeah, it's great. I got my nice keyboard in here now.
Yeah.
What else? Getting triggers for the sound bites, which we don't have right now. So I'll be randomly
You're gonna be okay, kid. You're gonna be okay.
We have an unmarked keyboard behind Kyle. The sound bites are there. We just don't know.
I don't know what key
where they are.
I have one key marked. Space weather news.
That's
later.
right.
But yeah, it's great. New table and new position.
Yeah.
So we can have 2 guests, maybe 3 in here at this point.
So if it isn't completely clear, those of you watching the video, we're sitting at a table facing each other. Kyle is right there. So right directly across from me. Yeah. I'm pointing at him and you can see my hand appear in the other. Yeah. So there was some question about what was going on in the last video we posted like this, where we were sitting facing each other and people were confused. They thought we were all in a line. No, we're facing.
See, this is why we never did video before, because it's like people just get distracted.
Yeah. They're like, what is that on your t-shirt? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, we're back into Hapgood's Path of the Pole. So this is interesting. I mentioned at the end of the last of what was it, part 24? What was it? What was the last part? 7?
I don't know.
That the next chapter, chapter 10, is the one that Hapgood keeps referencing all throughout the material we've been going through. This is the one where he's going to discuss the mammoths, the extinction event that happened at the end of the last ice age.
Yeah.
So I'm prepping for the show this week, and I'm going through all this material, and I'm like, man, because I can't recommend this latest Joe Rogan episode enough if you guys haven't listened to it yet.
I haven't.
Yeah, let me get the guy's name. I should have had this.
Boneyard, right?
Yes, the Boneyard.
In the Alaskan tundra or something like that?
He's been washing massive amounts of bones out of the... So, he's a gold miner, right? So this is like total Velikovsky, right? It just reminds me of the Velikovsky stuff. Velikovsky's talking about these gold miners going up there and they're washing the muck out to get to the gravel that is the gold-bearing gravel, right? Because the gold sinks all the way down, and then as the gravel is slowly moving over geological processes, the gold ends up on the bedrock.
To the bottom, yeah.
So they wash all the muck away, and the muck is like this. It's this incredibly fine sediment. It's very fine powder mixed with water, right? Like it's got water in it, but when they describe it as a frozen tundra, it's got all these animal bones and bits and trees, and then huge lenses of ice, and all of this stuff mixed together with a bunch of gravel at the bottom, and then it's just frozen solid, just rock hard,
oh
right?
My God. But that's a pain in the ass.
Yeah, and you have to get to the very bottom of that, to the bedrock to find the gold. And so miners have been washing this stuff, hydraulic washing of it,
Yeah.
And so he's got this property where they have like this massive boneyard. He's got hundreds of thousands of bones, and they've got this massive hose. I guess they have a machine or whatever. He describes you just turn it on and leave, let it go for a couple hours.
Yeah.
And then they come back and look.
That's so cool,
And I've
dude.
seen some of the pictures. There's a huge skull sticking out of this wall of gray silt that's frozen, with teeth sticking out of it and stuff. He's like finding so many species that are not supposed to have lived up there. Anyway, I can't recommend this episode of Joe Rogan enough to you guys.
Yeah, so they were just, all this stuff was just laid down in one massive flooding event or something like
Yes,
that.
in some cases, there's lots of soft tissue still there. Now, the most of this, he's not
because
finding.
it was not frozen, then it flooded, and then suddenly everything was frozen.
Right. He's not finding whole animals. They're all disarticulated, like completely ripped apart. They're finding fragments. But the crazy thing is
Blender
that
stuff.
Ivory is gets very easily and quickly destroyed if it's just laying on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be preserved. And we're going to go through this. Hopefully we'll get to this today in the book, but Hapgood is talking about how at least 25% of the ivory that's pulled out of the permafrost is
Pristine
to the point where carvers can use it.
Yeah. I need some keys for this new keyboard. Anybody working on excavating ivory?
So yeah, his name is John Reeves. It's episode 1918 from the Joe Rogan Experience. I've listened to it twice. It's amazing. And of course there's hints of, conspiracy. Or maybe you wouldn't call it conspiracy, but bones, massive amounts of bones got shipped to various universities or
and vanished.
museums and just went into crates. Some of them were dumped in the East River.
Oh my God.
So you guys got to listen to the show. It's great. So I just found it interesting that episode comes out and then I'm prepping for our show and we're getting into chapter 10 in Path of the Pole and it's talking about the same stuff. And I'm like, man, I'm actually probably reading in some cases about that guy's property because, his property is a big source of a lot of this stuff.
How long has he been doing this?
Well, the company, it's a complicated story, which he does go through in the show, but the company that he owns that purchased the land originally purchased it in the 20s. So they've had it a long time.
All
He's got an enormous amount of his company has an enormous amount of land in Alaska for gold mining. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
They finding any arrowheads in there too? Spoiler alert. I'll listen to the show.
Yes. But
Damn it.
but they have to be real careful with the archaeological
course.
remains.
Yeah, of course.
Because it's one thing if you're finding
Animal
fossils, but once you
Yeah.
start finding people stuff, it can get complicated fast. So anyway, we will be getting to that, but we do have a few things, and I actually struggled with this. I was like, should I just skip all this stuff and go straight to this chapter? But no, we need to finish what we were. I'm like, let's just skip this and get to the mammoths. But no. So we ended last time with we were talking about mountain building. And now we were on part 7 of chapter 9, sunken continents versus drifting continents. There is an extraordinary contradiction in the very fact that while continents are supposed to have been permanent, nearly all the sedimentary beds that compose them were laid down under the sea. There is no denying this fact. According to Schuchert, North America has been submerged no less than 17 times. According to Humphreys, the sea has covered as much as 4 million square miles of North America at one time. Termier argued that the sedimentary beds composing the mountain ranges extending eastwards from the Alps to Central Asia, which were laid down under the sea, would have required that the ancient Tethys Sea, in which they were laid down, should have been about 6,000 kilometers or 4,000 miles across. Geophysicists tend to argue that such seas, which clearly did exist, were merely shallow affairs, invasions of the continents by the ocean owing to some unknown cause. The positive evidence for this, based on the apparent absence from the sedimentary rocks of sediments formed in the very deep sea has a fallacy in it, as will be made plain. The positive evidence against the assumption that all these seas were shallow seas is, on the other hand, enormously strong. Umgrove, for example, remarks, not only have parts of the continents foundered below sea level since Precambrian times, but they have even done so until quite recently, and their subsidence occasionally attained great depths. The present continents are but fragments of one-time larger blocks. A particularly important example of such foundering seems to have occurred in the North Atlantic, off the northeastern coast of the United States. It has been found that the sediments that compose the northeastern states were derived in ages past from a land mass to the eastward in the present North Atlantic. This is very interesting. Some geologists have attempted to argue that these sediments might have been derived from a landmass situated on the present continental shelf, but the argument fails from every point of view. Brewster, for example, comments, "It must have been a large continent, for the sand and gravel and mud, which the rivers washed out to sea and the waves ground up on the shore, have built up most of half a dozen big states, while in some places the deposits are a mile thick." So they're talking about a lot of the states in the northeastern United States are built of washed out sediments from some other continent farther to the east of them that no longer exists above sea level anyway. Umgrove says that while it is impossible to estimate the size of the landmass, which is called Appalachia by the geologists, it was clearly large because they don't want to call it Atlantis. It was clearly large to judge from the fact that it has been possible to trace out in the sedimentary beds of the Appalachian Mountains the outline of an enormous delta formed by a giant river flowing out of the landmass to the east. So I'm not sure, but I'm imagining that. So we have the Appalachian Mountains, and folded in them is the remains, basically the fossil remnants of an enormous delta from the bottom of a river system that was to the east of the mountains. And that's just fascinating to me. So the mountains have since uplifted and carried this delta material with them, but they used to be flatlands, lowlands, where the river was flowing out into a flat plain from an enormous watershed system far to the east of the current continental shelf.
That's wild.
Now, the continental shelf of North America ends abruptly a very short distance from the coast. It is an extremely narrow strip between the coast and the so-called continental slope, where the rock formations dip down suddenly and steeply into the deep sea. Its average width is only 42 miles, and its maximum width does not exceed 100 miles. If the sediments had been derived from a landmass on this continental shelf, this very narrow landmass would have had to carry huge and repeatedly uplifted mountain ranges. Furthermore, since drainage would naturally have carried sediments down both slopes of these mountain ranges, a large proportion of the material would have been carried eastward and deposited in what is now the deep ocean, but there is no evidence of this. The suggestion that the enormous volume of sediments forming the northeastern states of the United States came from the continental shelf must be considered improbable. On the other hand, it is plain that the former continent in the North Atlantic could not have been eroded away by rivers any farther down than approximately sea level. Erosion did not dispose of the continent nor create the deep sea basin. After erosion had finished its work, the continent itself sank to a great depth. Umgrove has cited recent oceanographic research by Professor Ewing of Columbia, showing that this ancient landmass of Appalachia now lies subsided about 2 miles below the continental shelf.
What was the depth, do you remember, of the seamounts out there?
Some of them are
6 miles or so?
3 miles. Yeah, the flat top of the seamounts are, in some cases, 3 miles below the surface.
Near the Azores?
Yeah, there's some discussion of that later about, and I think I skipped a bunch of it because there's too many numbers, but we can discuss it in concept anyway. Where was I?
Sorry.
Okay, here we go. So this extraordinary case is by no means unique, for Umgrove has pointed out that the sediments composing much of Spitsbergen and Scotland come from the ocean west of them, while those composing the west coast of Africa come from a former landmass in the present South Atlantic. Most interesting of all, he indicates that the deepest of the world's deep sea troughs, east of the Philippines, which is about 7 miles deep, gives evidence that it was once part of a very large continent. The origin of the sediments on either side of the Atlantic has a very important bearing on the theory of continental drift. If America and Europe split apart, just where did these sediments come from? The problem is insoluble without assuming a continent in between. According to Umgrove, there is ample evidence of repeated upward and downward oscillations of the floor of the entire Pacific. In a kind of rhythm, this great ocean has become alternately shallower and deeper. In the absence of any explanation of this phenomenon, Umgrove becomes geopoetic. There seems to him to be something almost mystical in this slow pulsation of the living planet. He finds that the unexplained upward and downward movements are not limited to sea areas. Quote, "It should be noted that blocks that were first submerged, then elevated, and then once more submerged and elevated are also met with on the continents. The sub-oceanic features and the similar continental characteristics cannot be explained at present, for our knowledge of Precambrian history and terrestrial dynamics is not yet extensive enough," unquote. Comparatively radical vertical changes in the positions of land masses are evidenced by a considerable number of ancient beaches. Some of them, however, are not very old, which are now found at great elevations above sea level and sometimes far inland from the present coasts. Thus, the geologist P. Negris claims to have found evidences of beaches on 3 mountains of Greece: Mount Hymettus, Mount Parnassus, and Mount Gerania, at respectively 1,400 feet, 1,500 feet, and 1,700 feet above sea level. He found a beach on Mount Delos at 500 feet above sea level. William H. Hobbs cited a particularly interesting case of a beach a recent date, now 1,500 feet above sea level in California. Do we have anything like that here? Is there a beach associated with this shallow inland sea we were supposed to have here in the Cambrian? Or not the Cambrian,
officially, I don't know.
Okay.
I think we've found some.
Yeah, that's true.
We have, these, it's all lithified, but it's like, it looks like sand.
Yeah.
The rocks is just made up of sand that's been concreted together.
That's right.
And it's full of little broken shells and stuff.
Yeah.
Shallow marine shell, but
an actual beach, right? This is what they're talking about as a beach.
The thing we don't see, which you would see at a beach, is dunes, right? Like when we go to Utah, there's all those
wind-blown dunes.
Sand dunes. You should, I would imagine if you're on a beach, you might see dunes.
Yeah,
I guess there could be a forest right up to it, so maybe not.
Right? Yeah. Like some of the places we went in, if it's a very flat lowland area, that you may not have dunes at all.
Yeah.
Some of the parts of, for example, where we were in Florida, there'd be huge dunes, and other places it's just flat.
Yeah.
The trees came right up to the water. But I think
how
you would
deep
find
is that sand? Because those sand, you would have sandstone basically. Mm-hmm. We don't have sandstone here.
Yeah, they call it beach rock. It's
true.
It's noticeable beach rock.
Maybe we do. I don't know.
Yeah, because there's just so much obviously shallow marine stuff here that you think that there would be beaches somewhere.
The whole Edwards Plateau, though, is so heavily eroded.
Yeah.
That the sandstone layers are probably just gone.
Completely gone. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe they're under all the sand down there and down south off the plateau.
Yeah.
Because that's very sandy area down there. Yeah. Okay. Upon the coast of Southern California may be found all the features of wave-cut shores, now in perfect preservation, and in some cases as much as 1,500 feet above the level of the sea. These features are monuments to the grandest of earthquake disturbances which in recent times have visited the region. That was a quote from Hobbes. It would be possible to multiply endlessly the evidence of the raised beaches which are found in every part of the world. Many of them may imply changes in the elevations of the sea bottom, such as are suggested by Umgrove. One of the most remarkable features of the Earth's surface is the Great Rift Valley of Africa. The late Dr. Hans Kloos pointed out that the high escarpment along one side of this valley was once quite evidently at the very edge of the African continent. Not just the beginning of the continental shelf, but the very edge of the continental mass. In some vast movement, that side of the continent was tremendously uplifted, and the sea bottom was uplifted with it as much as a mile, and became dry land. This is so interesting a matter, and of such special importance for our theory, that I quote Kloos at length. There are two rims to the African continent. Twice the fundamental problem arises. Why do the continents of the Earth end so abruptly and plunge so steeply into the deep sea? Even more astounding, what is the meaning of the high, raised, and thickened mountain margins that most continents have? The short cross-section through the long Lebombo chain looks unpretentious, but it illuminates events far from this remote plot of the Earth. For here, the old margin of the continent is exposed. Not so long ago, during the Cretaceous period, the sea extended to here from the east. The flatland between the Lebombo Hills and the present coast is uplifted sea bottom. What we see are flanks of a downward bend of high Africa toward the Indian Ocean. But we see much more. The sedimentary strata are followed by volcanic rocks to the east of the hills. Some parallel the strata like flows or sheets poured over them and tilted with them. Others break across the sandstone layers and rise steeply from below. This means that as the continent's rim was bent downward at the Lebombo Hills, the crust burst and cracks opened through which hot melt shot upward and boiled over. So the eastern margin of Africa, at the turn of the Paleozoic period, was a giant hinge on which the crust bent down to be covered by the ocean. What we see here is merely a cross-section. One can go further north or south and even to the other side of the continent and discover that great stretches of this unique land have suffered the same fate. The oceans sank adjacent to the continents and the continent rose out of the ocean. Kloos makes it clear that in one geological period, the continent was bent down so that part of it became sea bottom, not merely continental shelf, and that at a later period it was uplifted some 6,000 feet. The sea bottom became land and the continental margin was shoved far to the east. When we contemplate gigantic movements of this sort, it seems reasonable to take the geophysical objections to changes in the positions of the continents with a grain of salt. If a large part of a continent can be shown not to have been permanent, it is unnecessary to concede the permanence of any of it. On the other hand, such changes need to be explained, and they need to be reconciled with basic principles of physics. The fact that theories of continent formation and history hitherto proposed have failed to solve this problem recently reduced L. Sprague de Camp to the following confession of ignorance. Since somebody can bring good, solid objections on one ground or another against all these hypotheses, however, we had better agree that nobody knows why continents or parts of continents sink and let it go at that. No doubt a sound explanation, perhaps combining features of the older theories, will be forthcoming someday. He got himself a certificate of ignorance there.
Look at this map I just found.
Oh, look at that, yeah. I
So
guess you'll
is
have
he-
to send it to me so I
Yeah,
can put
yeah,
it in
yeah.
post right here.
Is he talking about this part of Africa right
The
here?
African Rift, yeah.
It looks like it's cracked and
Yeah,
like
and that-
bending
and the-
down.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep, somebody broke that thing. It's busted. Okay, so it may be useful to consider, in juxtaposition, the African Rift with the question of the North Atlantic landmass already discussed. In a sense, the two are complementary. In one case, a continent apparently subsided. In the other, it first subsided and then was raised up. Quite obviously, the movements in both directions must have been related to one fundamental dynamic process. The physical geology of the rift, which can be directly examined, shows that the indirect evidence of the sedimentary rocks of the northeastern states of the United States and of Scotland and Spitsbergen, and the paleontological evidence must be taken seriously. The evidence in favor of an important landmass in the present North Atlantic cannot be dismissed. The theory of drifting continents does not offer a solution to these problems. So then part 8 goes into deep sea sediments. We're going to skip most of this, but he talks about the seamounts. And one of the interesting things about the seamounts, and we might have discussed this with Randall, I can't remember because it's been so long since we did those episodes, but the seamounts, they're massive mountains that are basically at the bottom of the sea, and most of them have flat tops. And the theory, this is what Hapgood is talking about, the theory is that the flat tops were caused by the fact that they used to be, that was the level of the sea at the time, and they got eroded flat, and then they sunk, right? So they're getting uplifted, and then they're basically cut off by erosion down to close to sea level, and then they sink down. But some of those...
They did find beach sediments, right, on those mountains.
Yeah. But some of the seamount flat tops are 3 miles below sea level.
Yeah,
so
of course.
So Hapgood is basically saying, like, this is a massive movement of the entire sea bottom.
Yeah.
You know, because the mountain isn't sitting in a hole. Like, it's not in its own hole that sunk it that far down. Like, the whole sea bottom has to drop the mountain down.
Yeah.
And he was like, one of the explanations was, over time, so much sediment is washed in from the continental shelves and ends up on the deep sea bottom, and then that causes isostatic response, and the whole thing sinks down. But there's been no evidence of enormous amounts of sediment on deep sea bottoms. They have very little sediment compared to what was thought was going to be found there.
Yeah.
So
that was earlier in the book too, right?
Yes. So there isn't going to be, there isn't going to be an massive isostatic response that can sink a mountain that used to be at sea level 3 miles down from the amount of sediment that's on the sea bottom. Okay, what time we got, by the way? I didn't. Oh, you did set the timer.
I did.
Timer is going.
The old Sands of Time.
Sands of Time.
Handy device.
Yes.
Recently invented. It's a very brand new type of clock.
High tech. It's very high technology.
It's there's nanotechnology in there.
There is nanotechnology. Yes. Yes. Okay. I just want to know, how did they get the sand in there?
I have no idea. Teleportation.
Yes. I mean, like, how do you make the glass, and then how do you get the sand inside once it's done? Okay, so part 9, which we have time enough to go through a little bit of this. Density changes in the lithosphere. It has, until lately, been the impression that the lithosphere, considered to be a crystalline layer between 20 and 40 miles thick, was itself composed of various layers, with rocks of increasing density at increasing depths. This would have been a natural development with a cooling Earth, for it might be supposed that the lighter materials in a liquid would tend to float on the heavier ones and would solidify in the order of their density, with the lightest on top. Daly in 1940 proposed the following layering of the lithosphere, at least beneath the continents. A, the sedimentary rocks at the surface. B, below these, a layer of basement rocks of granitic type, ending about 9 miles down. C, a third layer of rock of somewhat greater weight, about 15 miles thick. I'm glad that he doesn't describe them any more than that. Granite, and then heavier stuff. C, a third layer, and D, a fourth layer, 6 miles thick, of still heavier rock. Having proposed these layers, however, he added that, quote, the exact depths of the discontinuities are not easily demonstrated, unquote, and, quote, it seems clear that each of the breaks varies in its depth below the rocky surface, unquote. In another place, he gave evidence of light matter at the very bottom of the crust. These layers, then, according to Daly, are very peculiar. There is nothing regular about them. On the one hand, he gives rough estimates of their thicknesses. On the other hand, he indicates that these estimates are of little value. They are, in fact, mere rough averages. They indicate a trend toward increasing density with depth, together with enormous confusion in the distribution of materials. In view of the extreme uncertainties of Daly's view of the structure of the lithosphere, it can hardly come as a complete surprise that the most recent geophysical investigation of its structure by the method of sound wave surveying has failed to show any distinct layering at all. The geophysicists Tatel and Tuve have reported that the results of the most recent studies using the most recent techniques indicate that rocks of greater or less density are intermixed in utter confusion, and that the essential structure of the lithosphere is really that of a rubble on a large scale. So I think he doesn't really make this clear, but I think his point there, and it's a good point, is that rubble on a large scale implies a chaotic and jumbled mass of stuff that moves around a lot, rather than the standard sort of like, okay,
the slow cooling Earth.
Right, yeah. We had a molten ball, and it slowly cooled after it had time to segregate in, heaviness layers.
Right.
And then that is basically like, it's had some shifting, but not too much, and all the shifting has been really slow, so nothing gets jumbled. No, there's no order to it, which looks much more chaotic and dynamic.
Yeah. I was just thinking that isostasy could be a cause of like lighter materials being deeper. So if you have, say, the crust is pushing together and then it rises, it's like basically being forced upward because it's pushing together, right? And you get this like rising effect.
Yeah.
That if that relieved, I don't know if that's how it works, but I'm just saying, if that relieved pressure off of deeper, like molten stuff that was like close to the threshold of solidifying.
Oh, yeah.
Then it actually expands, right? Because maybe some dissolved gases are coming out. That expansion has a cooling effect. Mm-hmm. So then it could just solidify, expanding into a less dense form than the rock above it, because the rock above it is actually rising up.
Okay. Yeah.
But I don't know. What causes it to rise up? Is it pressure from underneath? Is it pressure from the sides?
Venus coming really close.
Yeah, that's true. That's what it was. Okay. We got to take a break.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the new revamped 10x10x10 Tangent Cube with the new music.
Oh yeah, it's new music.
Yeah, just a little bluesy jam. Me and Daniel laid down some fine bass line on it over the holidays. Right after I got all the equipment set up, we were like, let's jam. It's been great. It's inspiring having everything redone.
Yeah.
Real nice.
Very nice. And it's very clean.
Makes me want to be in here.
Spacious. I mean, relatively speaking, for the cube, spacious.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of space in here.
So
you're only running into stuff like every 10 seconds,
right,
as opposed to every 2 seconds.
Right, that's right. So we're gonna skip a bit here. Skip a bit, brother. But it's basically he's just continuing the discussion here of the composition of the lithosphere, about how rather than it being layered, it's very jumbled, and that doesn't seem to support the idea that continents are permanent. And he goes through some things. He's like, some of these geophysicists and geologists are discussing, like, now if you can expect some jumbling near the surface, but the fact that it's jumbled all the way down to the molten areas, that you find the lightest rock right above the magma in some cases, they're just like, this doesn't make sense. So skipping a bunch of that, but we'll catch the end of it here. So he says,
I was thinking about gravitational anomalies, though. Like,
yeah, a gravitational anomaly possibly being like a large dense thing deep in the crust.
yeah, if it's connected to mass,
Yeah.
in the way that in the standard model,
Yeah.
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 But you know, I mean, are we talking balloon Earth here or what? Anyways,
It's little tiny black holes.
yeah, that's what it is.
So, Jagger, he says, for one, considered that it was far more reasonable to account for subsidence or elevation at the surface by changes of weighting deep in the lithosphere than by erosion and sedimentation of the surface. He remarked, it would seem possible that intrusive and extrusive processes may lighten or weight the crust much more profoundly than the movement of sediments. In other words, intrusive and extrusive processes of magma and other things, rather than movements of sediments, which are the lightest form of rock that are always on the surface, movements of that around is not going to cause weight, moving of weight around in the crust much more than.
Get your hand out of my video, man.
I'm being hand wavy. So yeah, he's basically saying the heavier rock in the magma would lighten or weight the crust much more profoundly than the movements of sediments on the surface. So how precisely would these processes be apt to be set in motion by a displacement of the lithosphere? We did see that displacement would cause a general fracturing of the lithosphere, the creation of a new worldwide fracture pattern. In areas moved toward the equator, the extension of the surface area would involve some pulling apart of the lithosphere, the separation of the fragments, their subsidence into semi-liquid melt below, and the rise of the magma into the fractures, with, at some points, no doubt, massive eruptions on the surface. Differential movements of blocks of the lithosphere would occur as each sought its gravitational equilibrium, some rising and others subsiding. In areas moved poleward, compression would be the rule, with some folding of the lithosphere with block faulting, accompanied by tilting of larger or smaller blocks. In these areas, the strata of lighter rock would grow thicker from being folded upon themselves. In equatorward moving areas, on the other hand, they would tend to grow thinner because much of the lighter rock might be engulfed in the rising heavy magma. However, the destruction or creation of continents requires more massive changes. These might be of two sorts, though both of them must, in the nature of things, remain speculative for the present. One of these would be the massive intrusion of immense quantities of heavy magma into the lithosphere, resulting sometimes in plateau basalts, like the Columbia Plateau. You got this massive area of an enormous amount of basalt, which must have flowed from the, there's no pocket source for that in the lithosphere. It must have come from all the way down, because it's just too much material to be contained, in a pocket in the actual crust.
Yeah, that's crazy. I wonder,
Also, the Deccan traps would be a similar thing, I think.
Yeah. Like what forced it up? I mean, you think of something pushing down on the surface could force that just to flow up around it or something like that. Sort of a subsidence.
Well, I think because of the pressure that if somehow
just it cracked all the way
if a crack all the way down,
yeah, because then it's going to expand.
It's just going to just come flowing out of there and just
so as you're breaking the seal.
Yeah, that's right. You're breaking the seal.
Okay.
And that's kind of what he's just
opening the shook up soda can.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about. This results in plateau basalts, like when you got a whole crustal shift and it moves. The stuff going towards the equator, it's going to split open, and then just all this material flows outward.
So, yeah, so that makes me wonder, like, when the basalt comes out and say you get 1,000 feet of basalt, which is definitely like we've seen that easily.
Oh yeah, 4,000 feet in some
Yeah.
cases. Yeah.
So you get 4,000 feet of basalt layers on top of sediments, and then granite or
Yeah.
granitic bedrock, and then like more dense rock.
Yeah. and then later more dense rock.
So does that dense rock, does the granite down at the bottom melt when it gets shoved down deeper, or does it stay solid?
That's a good question. I mean, I would suppose that if it got pushed all the way down into the magma layer, it would probably
Hotter
start
and
to
higher
melt.
pressure,
yeah.
it would melt, yeah.
It would start to melt.
But maybe it doesn't all melt.
Maybe not.
It's also
yeah.
like, it's going to have a cooling effect.
Yeah.
Right? It's a much cooler material being pushed down into a hotter material. So they're both going to move towards each other. They're going to both change to reach equilibrium.
Yeah.
So you get some melting, then you'll get some cooling of the magma.
Yeah, that's right.
So you just, in general, I imagine you just end up with thicker crust there
Yeah, could be.
for a long
But there
time.
is some process that's causing continuous generation of heat. Like the interior of the earth is not, if it didn't have something constantly heating it up, it would be solid at this point, I think,
Right.
is the idea. So and I think we kind of went through some of this with Hapgood. He was like, but the idea that just radiation, because there's radioactive particles in all this material, and they thought for a while that this was just causing heat, and then it's so well insulated that the heat just stays in, but there's not enough that they know of. But there's friction, caused by the moon pulls on the earth,
Right,
The
yeah, the
tides,
tidal forces and
right? So
stuff.
everything's kind of sloshing back and forth, and it's a constant amount of friction. And then there's big flows of material, so that's causing friction. So something is keeping the interior of the Earth warm, like hot enough for all that. So you're right. Like a big chunk of granite getting down in the magma would tend to cause a cooling effect around it, but
Yeah,
there's some source of heat.
Yeah, so over time,
Over
it's
time,
going
it's
to
going
melt.
to melt all that granite. Yeah,
But the crust could be thicker there for a long time.
a long time. Yeah, especially if it's a mountain's worth of granite. Yeah, and there are known, like there's whole pieces of like oceanic material that's gone down in. It's carrying a bunch of water in there too, and then that stuff.
But of course, I mean, even just like 4,000 feet more is like really not much
No,
compared to how thick it is already. So
no, yeah,
it's just a tiny bit.
yeah. 40 miles,
Yeah, that
4,000 feet. It's not even 1 mile. So what might be the upshot of all these changes during displacement? The result might well be that while the distribution of light and heavy matter near the surface would be unchanged, its distribution between the surface and the bottom of the lithosphere would be materially changed. This, rather than the theory of continental drift, is probably the direction in which we must look for a solution to the problem of continents and ocean basins. I cannot close without reference to a singular confirmation of the line of reasoning adopted in this chapter, which I find in Umgrove's discussion of the work of the geologist J. Barrell, with whom he disagreed. Umgrove is considering the question of the submergence of continents. It is clear from his discussion that Barrell's conception of the process requires a theory of lithosphere displacement. Umgrove states the problem thus. If we are to suppose the submergence of continents, we must either suppose a change in the amount of ocean water, which, if it increased, could flood a continent or several at once, or the submergence of one continent balanced by the elevation of another. He presents the findings of specialists to show that the quantity of water on the Earth's surface has remained about the same from the earliest times, and adds, should one, nevertheless, cling to this theory of submerged continents, the only alternative would be to assume that while vast blocks were being submerged in one area, parts of the ocean floor of almost identical size were being elevated in others. It is not quite clear, however, why such opposed movements should have occurred in areas of almost equal extent. Nor is it clear why these movements should have occurred in such a way that the sea level remained comparatively stable. It is clear that in a displacement, 2/4 of the surface opposite each other must move towards the poles, while the other 2/4 must move toward the equator. Whatever forces tend to produce uplift in the poleward moving areas will be balanced by equal forces producing subsidence in the quarters moving equatorward. And the sea level would be stable, except for very minor fluctuations. Okay, chapter 10, this is what I wanted to get to. The extinction of the mammoths and the mastodons. Hapgood says, when this theory of crustal displacement was first presented to a group of scientists at the American Museum of Natural History on January 27th in 1955, Professor Walter H. Butcher, former president of the Geological Society of America, made an interesting observation. I had presented evidence to support the contention that North America had been displaced southward and Antarctica had been moved farther into the Antarctic Circle by movement of the crust at the end of the Ice Age. Professor Butcher pointed out that if this were so, there must have been an equal movement of the crust northward on the opposite side of the Earth. He asked me whether there was evidence of this, and I said that I thought there was, and I am presenting the evidence here. Part 1. The extinction of the mammoths. The closing millennia of the Ice Age saw an enormous mortality of animals in many parts of the world. Hibben estimated that as many as 40 million animals died in North America alone. Many species of animals became extinct, including mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, and woolly rhinoceroses. Camels and horses apparently became extinct in North America then or shortly afterward, although one authority believes a variety of Pleistocene horse has survived in Haiti. The paleontologist Scott is enormously puzzled both by the Great Climatic Revolution and by its effects. The extraordinary and inexplicable climatic revolution had a profound effect upon animal life and occasioned, or at least accompanied, the great extinctions, which, at the end of the Pleistocene, decimated the mammals over 3/5 of the Earth's land surface. No one has been able to explain these widespread extinctions. I shall attempt to explain them as consequences of the last displacement of the crust, but since the extinctions took place in both North America and in Asia, that is, both in the area presumably moved southward and in the area presumably moved northward, I shall concentrate first on Asia. There we shall find no difficulty in producing evidence to show that the climate of eastern Siberia grew colder as North America grew warmer, just as the theory requires. Among all the animals that became extinct in Asia, the mammoth has been the most studied. This is because of its size, because of the great range of its distribution, all the way from the New Siberian Islands in the Arctic Ocean across Siberia and Europe to North America, because pictures of it drawn by primitive man have been found in the caves of southern France and Spain, but most of all, perhaps, because some well-preserved bodies of mammoths have been found frozen in the mud of Siberia and Alaska. Ivory from these frozen remains has provided a supply for the ivory trade of China and Central Europe since ancient times. A study of the reports on the frozen mammoths reveals some very remarkable facts. In the first place, they increase in numbers the farther north one goes, and are most numerous in the New Siberian Islands, which lie between the Arctic coast of Siberia and the pole. Secondly, they are accompanied by many other kinds of animals. Thirdly, although ivory is easily ruined by exposure to the weather, uncounted thousands of pairs of tusks have been preserved in good enough conditions for the ivory trade. A fourth point is that the bodies of many mammoths and a few other animals have been preserved so perfectly in the frozen ground as to be edible today. Finally, astonishing as it may seem, it is not true that the mammoth was adapted to a cold climate. I shall first take up this question of the mammoth's alleged adaptation to cold. So yeah, this thing about the ivory is fascinating. He does get into it more later, but he talks about how it doesn't take much for a little bit of exposure to basically ruin it. It somehow dries the stuff out and it cracks, and then after that, it's no longer good for carving. So, part 2, the mammoth's adaptation to cold. Oh, what is Kyle? Kyle's looking up. How long does ivory last in the elements.
Is that a good search query?
Maybe, yeah.
Let's see here. I should do the screen recording of this as well. That would be cool.
Mhm.
But, we're figuring this out, folks.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep going.
Okay. It has long been taken for granted, without really careful consideration, that the mammoth was an Arctic animal. I just want to, before I dive into this part two, I do want to say that as I was reading through this, I kept thinking that, because he was saying, where is it here? He's basically saying, oh yeah, here it is. They are most numerous in the New Siberian Islands, which lie between the Arctic coast of Siberia and the pole. I kind of think that may be a function of preservation. It's possible. Like, a lot of these animals may have died in just as many numbers farther south, but they just weren't frozen solid forever, right? Yes, we find this huge concentration of them up in places where there's been basically permanent frozen tundra since the event took place.
Yeah.
We talk about how fossilization requires very specific circumstances. This is like an amazing. It just dawned on me while I was reading about this again, and after, of course, listening to that Joe Rogan interview, like how amazing this is. This is there are places where we find massive amounts of dinosaur era skeletons as well. Like in Wyoming, there's what is it called? I can't remember. There's a place there, another boneyard, but it's, millions of years old and it's full of dinosaur fossils, but there's almost no tissue. There's no tissue there. These are lithified, but these things have been frozen for, in some cases, 30,000 years, maybe, according to the dating. So they're not even Younger Dryas period, but they've been frozen a long time, and to the point where in some cases you can still eat the meat. That animals will still eat it. Wolves still eat if it gets exposed, wolves will, and other scavengers will eat the meat that's exposed on these animals.
Right.
That's an amazing kind of preservation there.
But it's just from freezing, pretty much. I mean, obviously, it's not just freezing. It has to be buried in that muck,
right?
As well, to prevent.
Yeah, you have to kill them very quickly, all at once. Carry a whole bunch of them in mass, along with all the other stuff. There's trees and other things in a kind of matrix of water and sand and all this stuff, and then lay all that stuff down and then have it freeze and never unfreeze for 10,000 years. And you're talking about animals that don't live, and plants that don't live in an Arctic environment. So they're in a kind of a warm or temperate place. Right? So this extraordinary event picks up all these animals and trees and forests and all this stuff, mixes it with a bunch of water and gravel and a whole bunch of and sand and all this other material, moves it in enormous masses where they gather in pockets, probably in the landscape where the water is flowing. So there's a backflow area or maybe an eddy current. They're all caught in there. And then I get to wave my hands. They get caught in a certain area in the landscape, and then the temperature of the area, which was at the time not cold, because you have certain kinds of trees and flowering plants that don't exist in the Arctic Circle, and then the whole thing has to basically turn into a permanent frozen landscape forever. Yeah. For at least until the present day, which is in some cases 20 or 30 or 40,000 years since this took place. You can't preserve organic tissue in any other way. If you just fossilized it it would just turn into stone. It's not. But in these cases, you can cut a steak off of it and cook it. It's like this is a very specific thing.
Yeah, it's like it has to be like freezing along with protecting it from oxidation.
Yeah,
is what I'm thinking. So you bury it in this muck. That's already anaerobic.
Protected from oxidation, from desiccation. It has to not dry out.
The muck has to have something that absorbs or bonds with all the oxygen quickly. and you put it in that, and then you freeze it.
Yeah.
So there's no bacteria that
And
will
it's-
infect it.
that's
There's
right,
no-
and
it's no oxidation. It's just preserved.
And he has some stuff in here where they're talking to experts on freezing food,
Yeah.
right? And they're saying like you can't just deep freeze it instantly. That'll cause damage, and you can't freeze it a little bit and leave it that way because then it'll dry out. Right. There's a certain way you have to do it. You bring it to a certain temperature and let it kind of freeze, and then you drop it real low, and then you can never raise it above that temperature.
Yeah. Man, it's crazy.
So it's a very specific set of circumstances that, that industries today spend a lot of money on facilities to do this specific process so that you can preserve meat for a long time. But it happened naturally over enormous areas.
Man, look at this. So, agents of deterioration of ivory. Okay, physical forces, fire, pests, light, ultraviolet, and infrared, incorrect relative humidity,
Yeah.
thieves and vandals, water, pollutants, incorrect temperature, and disassociation. So those are like the categories on Wikipedia here.
Oh, yeah.
I don't mention oxygen, so maybe that's not an issue. But
Well-
relative humidity,
Yeah.
it absorbs and releases moisture with changing humidity. Ivory tends to shrink, swell, crack, split, and or warp on exposure to extremes or fluctuations in relative humidity and temperature. Low relative humidity causes desiccation, shrinkage, and cracking, while high relative humidity can cause warping and swelling.
Yeah.
And in underwater, it says the organic components in ivory is called ossein, maybe?
Yeah.
OSSEIN, which is decomposed by hydrolysis and after long-term exposure can cause the ivory to turn into a sponge-like substance. Even for cleaning purposes, water can damage ivory, so it should be avoided.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Been cleaning those piano keys on that upright with water on a rag for years. Corroded metals and colored materials can stain ivory. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that I think
Fluctuation in relative humidity. But which what?
that organic component. If that stuff is ruined and it loses it, it becomes not good for carving. Right? This is what they were talking about. For the
okay.
ivory trade, it's very
Hydrolysis.
specifically, yeah. So
Turns into a sponge.
they get flooded in water, but then it's frozen. Right? So it's a very specific circumstance. It actually preserves, even though they're stuck in wet material, it's preserving that organic component in the ivory.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll take this. Oh. I don't think that was recorded. My computer made a very strange sound for that screenshot.
Yeah. Okay, so it has long been taken for granted without very careful consideration that the mammoth was an Arctic animal. The opinion has been based on the mammoth's thick skin, on its hairy coat, and on the deposit of fat usually found under the skin. Yet it can be shown that none of these features mean any special adaptation to cold. To begin with, the skin and the hair. We have a clear presentation of the facts by the French zoologist and dermatologist H. Neuville. His report was published as long ago as 1919. He performed a comparative microscopic study of sections of the skin of a mammoth and that of an Indian elephant. So again, think of this. He's able to study in detail the organic skin of a mammoth. This is what I'm talking about.
That's wild.
And he's able to take it and compare it to an existing Indian elephant, right? He shows that they were identical in thickness and structure. They were not merely similar, they are exactly the same. Then he showed that the lack of oil glands in the skin of both animals made their hair less resistant to cold and damp than the hair of the average mammal. In other words, the hair and fur of the mammoth show a negative adaptation to cold.
So it's like some kind of...
Yeah, most mammals they secrete oil. They've got glands that keeps their hair or fur or whatever slightly oily, and that is an adaptation to cold and against dampness. Mammoths and elephants don't have this. Now, the modern elephants, they're all very warm tropical creatures, right? But the mammoth is supposed to be, it's commonly thought of, it's big and fuzzy. He lives in the Arctic. He's got a warm coat, but no, this This is
I
not
wonder
the
if the
case.
coat has actually a cooling effect. Like, is that what he's saying?
Yes, I think it turns out that the common ordinary sheep is better adapted to Arctic conditions. And he quotes the guy, "We have two animals very nearly related zoologically, the mammoth and the elephant, one of which lived in severe climates while the other is now confined to certain parts of the torrid zone. The mammoth, it is said, was protected from the cold by its fur and by the thickness of its dermis. But the dermis, as I have said, and as the illustrations prove, is identical in these two instances. It would therefore be hard to attribute a specially adaptive function to the skin of the mammoth versus the modern elephant.
Yeah.
The fur, much more dense, it is true, on the mammoths than on any of the living elephants, nevertheless is present only in a very special condition which is fundamentally identical in all of these animals. Let us examine the consequences of this special condition, consisting, I may repeat, in the absence of cutaneous glands. The physiological function of these glands is very important." And he has a footnote here. "It is merely necessary to mention that according to the opinion now accepted, that of Una, the effect of the sebum," what's that? Let me see if I can look that up real quick. Sebum, an oily secretion of the sebaceous glands. "The effect of the sebum is to lubricate the fur, thus protecting it against disintegration, and that of the sweat is to soak the epidermis with an oily liquid, protecting it also against desiccation and disintegration. The absence of the glandular secretions puts the skin in a condition of less resistance, well known in dermatology. It is superfluous to recall that the sebaceous impregnation gives the fur in general its isolating properties and imparts to each of its elements, the hairs, its impermeability, thanks to which they resist with a well-known strength all disintegrating agents, and notably those which are atmospheric. Everyone knows to what degree the presence of grease produced by the sebaceous glands renders wool resistant and isolating, and to what degree the total lack of this fatty matter lessens the value of woolen goods." So that's a quote from the study.
Guess we better stop washing our hair.
Right.
Be more resistant to all
That's right.
deteriorating agents.
Neuville points out both that the mammoth lack sebaceous glands and that the oil from these glands is an important factor in the protection of an animal against the cold. It is probable that protection from damp is more important than protection from low temperature. Oil in the hair must certainly impede the penetration of damp. The hair of the mammoth, deprived of oil, would seem to offer poor protection against the dampness of an Arctic blizzard. Sanderson has pointed out that thick fur by itself means nothing. Many animals of the equatorial jungles, such as tigers, have thick fur. Fur by itself is not a feature of adaptation to cold, and fur without oil, as Neuville points out so lucidly, is a feature of adaptation to warmth, not cold.
Wow. That's cool. The greasers were onto something, folks.
So yeah, I guess the point here is that in this case, I think this is what this guy might be pointing out, is that in this case, the mammoth has a similar skin to the elephant, and it isn't protected against desiccation by oils and all that stuff. And so if they live in a relatively dry climate, then the fur will protect against that versus protecting against cold and damp. You see what I mean? I don't know if that's what he's saying, but it seems like maybe that's what it is. So the question of the importance of oily secretions from the skin for the effectiveness of resistance of fur or hair to cold and damp is, however, highly involved. Very many inquiries directed to specialists in universities, medical schools, and research institutes over a period of more than 5 years failed to elicit sufficiently clear and definite answers. Until finally, Dr. Thomas S. Aguirres, professor of zoology at Brown University, referred me to the Headquarters Research and Development Command of the United States Army. This agency, in turn, very kindly referred me to the British Wool Industry Research Association. I addressed an inquiry to them regarding the effects of natural oil secretions from the skin on the preservation of wool, and they replied in general confirmation of Neuville. Quote, "Those interested in wool assume that the function of the wool wax is to protect the wool fibers from the weather and to maintain the animal in a dry and warm condition. Arguments in this direction are, of course, mainly speculative. We do know, however, that shorn wool in its natural state can be stored and transported without entanglement of the fibers, while scoured wool becomes so entangled that during subsequent processing, fiber breakage at the card is significantly increased. It seems reasonable, therefore, to assume that the wool wax is responsible not only for conferring protection against the weather, but also for the maintenance of the fleece in an orderly and hence more efficacious state.
Wool wax.
Wool wax, which is what they're calling the, the sebaceous secretions. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's cool. We're up on time.
Okay.
Interesting facts about wool. You heard it here second. We'll be right back.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is. Useless facts. So interesting.
But they teach you about mammoths.
Yeah, I know.
Come on.
I know, it's great.
Wouldn't you love to have a mammoth wool coat, bro?
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, we need to clone them. I want one.
Learning about woolly mammoth wool here on Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Part 8. Is this part 8? It's part 8 of our book report.
I don't know. It's been a long time.
On Path of the Pole.
Yeah.
By Charles Hapgood. So all of this digression into this tangent about wool and wool wax and skin and elephants and everything is basically he's just trying to show you that there's been this misconception that they're adapted for cold, and the evidence doesn't point in that direction. So he finishes this section by saying, it appears that there has been no scientific study of the precise points at issue here. No one has measured in any scientific way the quantitative effect of oily secretions in keeping heat in or moisture out. Despite this fact, however, we are at least justified on the basis of the facts cited above in rejecting the claims advanced for the hair of the mammoth as an adaptive feature to a very cold climate. Neuville goes on to destroy one or two other arguments in favor of the mammoth's adaptation to cold. Quote, it has been thought that the reduction of the ears, very thick and very small relatively to those of the existing elephants, might be so understood in this sense. Such large and thin ears as those of the elephants would probably be very sensitive to the action of cold. But it has also been suggested that the fattiness and peculiar form of the tail of the mammoth was an adaptive character of the same kind. However, it is to the fat-rumped sheep, animals of the hot regions whose range extends to the center of Africa, that we must go for an analog to the last character. In other words, the closest analog to the tail of the mammoth is a sheep that lives in near the equator.
Yeah. That's cool. Huh.
It is therefore only thanks to entirely superficial comparisons which do not stand a somewhat detailed analysis that it has been possible to regard the mammoth as adapted to the cold. On account of the peculiar character of the pelage, the animal was, on the contrary, at a disadvantage in this respect. What word is that? Let me look that one up.
What, pelage?
Yeah. The fur.
Oh.
Pelage. Maybe I said it wrong. The fur, hair, or wool. So there remains the question of the layer of fat, about 3 inches thick, which is found under the skin of the mammoth. This fat is thought to have provided insulation against the bitter cold of the Siberian winter. The best opinion of physiologists is opposed to the view that the storage of fat by animals is a measure of self-protection against cold. The consensus is, on the contrary, that large fat accumulation testifies chiefly to ample food supply obtainable without much effort. In other words, pelage.
Pelage.
In other words, when there's lots of food and it's easy to get, you get fat. That's basically
Yeah.
what they're saying. So ample food supply obtainable without much effort, as is indeed the case with human beings. Physiologists agree that resistance to cold is mainly a question of the metabolic rate rather than insulation by fat. Since the length of capillaries in a cubic inch of fat is less than the length of capillaries in a cubic inch of muscle, blood circulation would be better in a thin animal. We might ask the question, which would be more likely to survive through a Siberian winter? A man burdened with 50 or 100 pounds of surplus fat, or a man of normal build who is all solid muscle, assuming that winter conditions would mean a hard struggle to obtain food? Dr. Charles P. Lyman, professor of zoology at Harvard, remarked regarding this question of fat, quote, "It is true that many animals become obese before the winter sets in, but for the most part it seems likely that they have become obese because they have an ample food supply in the fall, rather than that they are stimulated by cold to lay down a supply of fat. Cold will ordinarily increase the metabolic rate of any animal, which means that it burns up more fuel in order to maintain its ordinary weight, to say nothing of adding the weight in the form of fat. The amount of muscular activity in the daily life of either type of elephant is certainly just as important as the stimulus of cold as far as laying down a supply of fat is concerned," unquote.
That's interesting.
This,
Is it possible that they hibernated?
yeah, I don't know. I don't think elephants hibernate,
Well, yeah.
but mammoths are, yeah.
But I mean, if they're...
It's really interesting how he's saying that the skin,
They wouldn't if they weren't living in cold climates. I mean, they're,
Right.
Yeah. So
yeah, that's the other thing is like, if they were adapted to Arctic climates, what the hell were they supposed to be eating during the winter
Yeah.
when there's nothing?
yeah,
They have to eat tons of food. I mean, like a very large amount of food they need to eat every day.
you get these bears that I don't know a whole lot about them, but I mean they eat a ton of food and then they just sleep.
Right. And when they wake up, they're starving and they're thin.
famished. Yeah.
Yes, right. But they get enormously fat when there's lots of food, and then they go to sleep, and all of that fat goes away. Yeah, and when they wake up, they're very hungry. And yeah, other mammals do hibernate. It's totally possible. But where is a mammoth? Is it just gonna lay down in the field?
You need to find a large cave.
Lots of very large caves. If you have 40 million of them, right?
Well, they go to Mammoth Cave.
Yeah. So this statement suggests that there is no basis for the assumption that the fat of the mammoths adapted them to an Arctic climate. On the other hand, it is quite true that, so I want to say that it seems like that people have assumed that they were Arctic animals because so many of them have been found there. But Hapgood is basically saying it wasn't the Arctic when they were there. That's his solution. I find this, and we've made multiple comparisons of Hapgood's ideas with the Comet Research Group and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. I think that maybe these things they're not mutually exclusive, and it's possible that both things happen.
Well, what could be the trigger, to get the crust moving?
Yeah, right.
An impact.
Yes. So, on the other hand, it is quite true that the storage of fat in the fall may help animals to get through the winter when food is scarce. The winter does not, however, have to be an Arctic winter. A winter such as we have in temperate climates is quite cold enough to cut the available food supply for herbivorous animals. It seems that under favorable circumstances, even the African and Indian elephants accumulate quite a lot of fat. F.G. Benedict, in his comprehensive work on the physiology of the elephant, considers it to be a fatty animal. The resemblances between the mammoth and the Indian elephant extend further than the identity of their skins in thickness and structure, and the fact that they were both fatty animals. Bell suggests that they were only two varieties of the same species. Quote, Falconer insists on the importance of the fact that throughout the whole geological history of each species of elephant, there is a great persistence in the structure and mode of growth of each of the teeth, and that this is the best single character by which to distinguish the species from one another. He finds, after a critical examination of a great number of specimens, that in the mammoth, each of the molars is subject to the same history and same variation as the corresponding molar in the living Indian elephant, unquote. It is clear that the similarities in the life histories of each of the teeth of these two animals were more important than the differences in the shapes of the teeth, which were such as might easily occur in two varieties of the same species. It cannot be denied that two varieties of the same species may be adapted to different climates, but it must be conceded that the adaptation of two varieties of the same species, one to tropical jungles and the other to Arctic conditions, is against the probabilities.
So he's saying there that he was talking about the teeth being worn in the same ways, like they were eating the same food.
Right.
Yeah.
The same types of foods.
For the same length of time. Like, yeah.
Okay, part 3, the present climate of Siberia. The people who lay the greatest stress on the adaptation of the mammoth to cold ignore the other animals that lived with the mammoths. Yes, we know that along with the millions of mammoths, the northern Siberian plains supported vast numbers of rhinoceroses, antelope, horses, bison, and other herbivorous creatures, while a variety of carnivores, including the saber-toothed cat, preyed upon them. What good does it do to argue that the mammoth was adapted to cold when it is impossible to use the argument in the case of several of the other animals? Like the mammoths, these other animals ranged far to the far north, to the extreme north of Siberia, to the shores of the Arctic Ocean, and yet farther north to the Lyakov and New Siberian Islands, only a very short distance from the pole. It has been claimed that all the remains on the islands may have been washed there from the mouths of the Siberian rivers by spring floods. I shall consider this suggestion a little later. So far as the present climate of Siberia itself is concerned, Nordenskiöld made the following observations of monthly averages of daily centigrade temperatures during the year along the Lena River. And there's a list of temperatures here. But he says the average for the whole year was 16.7 or plus 2 degrees Fahrenheit, so 16.7 degrees. It appears that only 3 months out of the year are reasonably free from frost. Even so, there must be frequent frosts in July, notwithstanding the occasional high midday temperatures. High temperatures on some days would bring the monthly mean down, even if night frost continued through July. No doubt it was knowledge of these conditions that caused the great founder of modern geology, Sir Charles Lyell, to remark that it would doubtless be impossible for herds of mammoths and rhinoceroses to subsist throughout the year, even in the southern part of Siberia. If this is the case with Siberia, what are we to think when we contemplate the New Siberian Islands? There, the remains of mammoths and other animals are most numerous of all. There, Baron Toll, the Arctic explorer, found remains of a saber-toothed tiger and a fruit tree that had been 90 feet tall when it was standing. The tree was well preserved in the permafrost with its roots and seeds. Toll claimed that green leaves and ripe fruit still clung to its branches.
That's what I was going to ask is like, they think that these animals are Arctic animals. Well, where, like, if they're finding the animal bones, where aren't there plants and trees also that they're finding? So
Yeah. Like in
it
this
should be
case.
clear. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It should be clear. I mean, I'm sorry, I was doing some Googling, but it should be clear that they weren't living in that environment.
You mean an Arctic environment,
Yeah.
like an Arctic climate?
Yeah,
Yeah.
not just from the animal, because it seems like weird that there's even this idea that the mammoth was an Arctic animal when they're finding them with plants that are not Arctic plants.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. That's a strange thing.
So here are the New Siberian Islands.
What's okay? Kyle's got Google Earth pulled up.
Yeah.
Which way is north?
The North Pole is like right
it's right there. Okay.
I mean, there's green.
Every way is south, basically.
That's right.
Okay.
I want to see the.
Okay. So he says, yeah, the tree, a 90-foot tall fruit tree that still had green leaves and ripe fruit clinging to its branches, frozen in the permafrost.
Yeah.
On the New Siberian Islands. Yet at the present time, the only representative of tree vegetation on the islands is a willow that grows 1 inch high. So now let us return to the question of whether all these remains were floated out to the islands on spring floods. Let us begin with a backward view at the history of these islands. Sachs, Belov, and Lapina point to evidence that there were luxuriant forests growing on the New Siberian islands in Miocene and perhaps Pliocene times. At the beginning of the Pleistocene, the islands were connected with the mainland, and the mammoths ranged over them. In the opinion of these writers, the vast numbers of mammoth remains on Great Lyakov Island indicate that they took refuge on the island when the land was sinking. There is no evidence that they were washed across the intervening sea. So you see, like just looking at this map, the idea that they were washed out of a river across 200 miles of ocean and onto those islands is kind of silly.
Yeah.
The improbabilities in this suggestion of transportation of these hundreds of thousands of animal bodies across the entire width of the Nordenskjold Sea for a distance of more than 200 miles from the mouth of the Lena River are simply out of all reason. Let us see exactly what is involved. First, we should have to explain why the hundreds of thousands of animals fell into the river. To be sure, they did not fall in all at once. Nevertheless, they must have had the habit of falling into the river in very large numbers, because only one body in a very great many could possibly float across 200 miles of ocean. Of those that floated at all, only a few would be likely to float in precisely the correct direction to reach the islands. Islands, even large ones, are amazingly easy to miss, even in a boat equipped with rudder and charts. The Lena River has 3 mouths, one of which points in a direction away from the islands. The other 2 mouths face the islands across these 200 miles of ocean. Occasionally, a piece of driftwood might float across the intervening sea. Occasionally, perhaps an animal, if for some reason it did not happen to sink, if it were not eaten by fishes, it might be washed up on the shore of one of the islands. It seems probable that only a very powerful current could transport the body of a mammoth across 200 miles of ocean. But let us suppose that somehow the animals are transported across the ocean. What then? The greatest of the New Siberian islands is about 150 miles long and about half as wide. Not one single account of the explorations on these islands has mentioned that the animal remains are found only along the beaches. They are obviously found also in the interior. Are we to suppose that the floods of the Lena River were so immense that they could inundate the New Siberian islands 200 miles at sea? It is safe to say that all the rivers of Europe and Asia put together at full flood would fail to raise the ocean level 200 miles off the coast by more than a few inches. But again, let us suppose that the remains were merely washed to the present coasts and not into the interior. How then were they preserved? How were hundreds of thousands of mammoths placed above high water mark? Storms, no doubt, but whatever storms can wash up, other storms can wash away. No accumulation of anything occurs along the coasts because of storms. All that storms can do is destroy. They can grind up and destroy anything. And they would have ground up and destroyed all the bodies, including, of course, the 90-foot tree with its branches, roots, seeds, green leaves, and ripe fruit. I think it is plain that the only reason suggestions of this kind are advanced is that there is a need to support some theory that has been developed to explain some other part of the evidence, some local problem. Moreover, there is always need, to discredit the evidence that argues for drastic climatic changes. Naturally, the knowledge that the Arctic islands, though they are now in polar darkness much of the year, were in very recent geological times able to grow the flourishing forests of a temperate climate eliminates any need to insist that they were always as cold as they are today. Thus, it is not a question at all of whether the climate grew colder, but merely a question of when the change occurred. Campbell has contributed a suggestion with regard to the alleged floating of hundreds of thousands of bodies across the Nordenskjold Sea. He notes that bodies ordinarily float because of gas produced by decomposition. Decomposition is at a minimum in very cold water, and therefore bodies ordinarily do not float in very cold water.
Good to know.
Yeah. Pro tip, folks. As an example of this, he points to a peculiarity of Lake Superior. The waters of this lake are very cold, and there is an old saying in the lake region that Lake Superior never gives up its dead.
Ooh.
They just go to the bottom and stay there.
Good to know. So, So why? What? This is the 1970s. He's writing,
Yeah.
right?
50s and then the 70s.
50s and then the 70s. So why at that time did they not want to admit? Why don't they want to accept drastic climatic changes? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but
Because, climate change on that scale, and I don't know, but I think the implication is too outside the scope of the uniformitarian ideas of, because you're not
necessary. Because he mentioned Lyell in there,
yeah, Charles Lyell, yeah,
which is he was like
a father of geology, yeah, working with Darwin.
Darwin,
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to point out.
Yeah.
That those two guys were working together, and like Darwinian evolution needed geology to be a certain way
Yeah.
to help it explain how these things happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like that narrative is created, and then you don't want to disturb that
Right.
with gigantic catastrophes that are normal, quite normal.
Yeah.
Like as you go, like you were pointing out, you go dig down through the crust and it's just a jumbled, chaotic mess, which means like there must be
There isn't like a slow, yeah, that's right.
crazy stuff happening
It's dynamic
quite
and
often.
yes, right. Right. And it's a problem with
Survival of the lucky.
That's right. I mean, it has been pointed out, like the mammoths were the fittest, right? They existed all this time, and just you had the apex species all over the planet just get destroyed
Yeah.
by geological processes. Same thing in the dinosaurs. These mass extinction events kill the fittest,
Right.
the top of the evolutionary chain, But, the other argument that can be made is that makes way for new kinds of species to fill those same ecological niches.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me, is that the process of evolution would naturally reach this sort of
Like a plateau.
plateau
Yeah.
where everything is adapted
And stable.
enough and stable and like has enough food, and all the way down the chain everybody's like doing okay.
Yeah.
So you might have minor changes and stuff, but then if you have this catastrophe, this possibly you could have rapid change because there's these huge voids now.
Massive gaps in
Where-
it. Yeah.
And then pressures as well for
Right.
species to change their behavior, to
Right.
do different things.
Plus all the hybridization,
Yeah, of course, right?
Yeah.
Dang. Can't find another mammoth.
Right. That's how did you get hairless elephants? I mean, come on.
Mammoths and pigs. That's all I gotta say. It's what they kind of look like, giant pigs.
Freaking mammigs, bro. Pimmoths. Okay, so Lake Superior never gives up its dead. The Arctic Ocean is much colder than the waters of Lake Superior. The water of the Lena would not be warm even in midsummer, but during the spring floods, when the Lena would be swollen with the meltwater of the winter snows, the water would be frigid, and the bodies of animals drowned in it would not decompose, nor would they float. They would tend to sink instead into the nearest hole, and perhaps never come to the surface. Part 4, a sudden change of climate. So we may reasonably conclude that the climate of Siberia changed at the end of the Pleistocene and that it grew colder. Our problem is to discover what process of change was involved. On the one hand, our theory of displacement of the crust involves a considerable period of time and a gradual movement. On the other hand, the discovery of complete bodies of mammoths and other animals in Siberia so well preserved in the frozen ground as to be in some cases still edible seems to argue a cataclysmic change. To those who in the past have argued for very sudden catastrophe, the specialists in the field have offered opposing theories to explain the preservation of the bodies. One of these was that as the mammoths walked over the frozen ground, over the snowfields, they may have fallen into pits or crevasses and been swallowed up and permanently frozen. Or, again, they might either have broken through river ice and been drowned or have gotten bogged while feeding along the banks. I just find this hilarious as an explanation for one small place having hundreds of thousands of bones all piled up with trees. You know, like the trees are also falling into the crevasse.
Yeah.
Walking trees that fall into, you know, they break through the ice of the river and fall in.
Yeah.
So there is no doubt that a certain number of animals could have been put into the frozen ground in just the manner suggested above. That this is the explanation for the preservation of the mammoth's bodies generally, however, is unlikely for a number of reasons. So I also want to point out that he uses that exact explanation later, and we'll have to get to it next episode, but I thought it was pretty funny because he seems like he's backfilling and he's trying to explain something that doesn't really fit with his theory, which is the mammoth that Randall has discussed a bunch, the one that was very well preserved, that still had food in its stomach, that, you know, has the broken hips, right? This one that came washing out. Well, the dating, we'll get to it, but the dating doesn't quite match his theory. It's too old. So he tries to explain how it got there, and he says, well, it fell into a crevasse, and he basically uses this.
Is he doing that to be funny?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think he's just...
He fell into a crevasse, and that's why his legs, his hips were broken.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, well, he's trying... No, what Hapgood is trying to explain with that particular mammoth is how it remained frozen because it's too old. Right.
For the shift.
Right.
Okay, gotcha.
He's like, I've just shown us all this data that shows that the Arctic Ocean was warm for a really long period. And he's like, this mammoth is so old that it stayed frozen through that entire period. How is this possible? And so he's like, maybe it was in a deep crevasse, you know, whatever. And he kind of makes it an outlier, but it's sort of funny to kind of watch him try to explain it. Anyway, we'll get to that later. I'm pulling a Marty on that one. So, yeah, we'll get to that.
God damn.
So it is not generally realized in the first place that it is not merely a matter of the accidental preservation of 80-odd mammoths and half a dozen rhinoceroses that have been found in the permafrost. These few could perhaps be accounted for by individual accidents, provided, of course, that we agreed that the animals concerned were Arctic animals. The sudden freezing and consequent preservation of the flesh of these animals might be thus explained. But there is another factor of great importance which has been consistently neglected. It has been overlooked that meat is not the only thing that has to be frozen quickly in order to be preserved. The same is true of ivory. Ivory, it appears, spoils very quickly when it dries out. Tens of thousands of skeletons and individual bones of many kinds of animals have been discovered in the permafrost. Among them have been found the enormous numbers of mammoths' tusks, as already mentioned. To be of any use for carving, tusks must either come from freshly killed animals or have been frozen very quickly after the deaths of the animals and kept frozen. Ivory experts testify that if tusks are exposed to the weather, they dry out, lose their animal matter, and become useless for carving. According to Lydecker, about 20,000 pairs of tusks in perfect condition were exported for the ivory trade in the few decades preceding 1899. Yet even now, there is no end in sight. According to Digby, about a quarter of all the mammoth tusks found in Siberia are in good enough condition for ivory turning. This means that hundreds of thousands of individuals, not merely 80 or so, must have been frozen immediately after death and remained frozen. Obviously, it is unreasonable to attempt to account for these hundreds of thousands of individuals by the assumption of such rare individual accidents as has been suggested above. Some powerful general force was certainly at work. Lydecker gives many hints of the nature of this force in the following passage. Quote, in many instances, as is well known, entire carcasses of the mammoth have been found thus buried with the hair, skin, and flesh as fresh as frozen in New Zealand sheep in the hold of a steamer. And sleigh dogs as well as Yakuts themselves have often made a hearty meal on mammoth flesh thousands of years old. In instances like these, it is evident that mammoths must have been buried and frozen almost immediately after death. But as the majority of the tusks appear to be met with in an isolated condition, often heaped atop one another, It would seem that the carcasses were often broken up by being carried down the rivers before their final entombment. Even then, however, the burial, or at least the freezing, must have taken place comparatively quickly, as exposure in their ordinary condition would speedily deteriorate the quality of the ivory. So he's saying not only were they frozen immediately after death, but the condition they're found in implies that, a lot of times you find piles of tusks and no mammoth parts otherwise. Just the tusks have been sorted somehow. There might be fragments of bones, but you just find huge piles of tusks just all jumbled together in this stuff.
That's very Fortean right there.
Yeah.
Giant.
Yeah.
Nothing but tusks.
Right.
I don't know. That's weird.
That's what he means when he says the majority of the tusks appear to be met with in an isolated condition, heaped atop one another.
That's crazy.
But again, so
Maybe they float.
Well, they don't roll very well. I'm serious. Like they're hard to break for one thing, and they've got this big curve.
They would definitely get ripped off the animal in a flood.
They break off, and then after that, they're more difficult to move than the rest of the bits of the animal. So they kind of, you see what I'm saying? Because they've got this big curve, so they don't want to roll.
Yeah.
It's hard to push them and slide them or whatever. So they
get tangled with each other.
Yeah.
I wonder if they float though.
I don't think they float.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Maybe they do. I don't know.
Well,
I don't think so.
I had a bullhorn once, and I made it into a horn, and I took it on a kayaking trip, and then it fell off the kayak and sank. So I don't think they float either.
And that's different material too, right? It's not the same as ivory.
No, but it's like fingernail material,
Right.
whatever that stuff's called.
Yeah.
I was going to say keratin, but I don't know if that's what it is. I'll have to look it up.
So, who is this? This is Lydecker. So the quote continues. How the mammoths were enabled to exist in a region where their remains became so speedily frozen. What?
They're covered in a tough coating of keratin.
Yeah. You can look it up. Does ivory float? I bet it doesn't.
I'm just going to see if tusks float. Do ducks float is what it asked me if I meant.
Do ticks fly? Do ducks float? Do ticks fly? Did you mean one of these?
No. Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to continue on here.
Yeah.
So how the mammoths were enabled to exist in a region where their remains became so speedily frozen, and how such vast quantities of them became accumulated at certain spots, are questions that do not at present seem capable of being satisfactorily answered, and their discussion would accordingly be useless. So I like this quote because, again, he points out vast quantities of them became accumulated at certain spots.
Yeah.
The animals themselves. So Lydecker was not alone in feeling the futility of considering these mysterious facts. For many years in this field, as in others, there has been a tendency to put away questions that could not be answered. However, we shall return to his statement. I shall try to show later on how all the details of the phenomena he describes can be made understandable. For the moment, I would like to point out simply that some sort of abrupt climatic change is required. This conclusion is reinforced by the results of recent research in the frozen foods industry. This has produced evidence that throws additional doubt on the theory of the preservation of the bodies of mammoths by individual accidents. It seems that the preservation of meat by freezing requires some rather special conditions. Herbert Harris, in an article in Science Digest, writes, quote, "What Birdseye had proved was that the faster a food can be frozen at deep temperatures of around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the less chance there is of forming the large ice crystals that tear down cellular walls. and tissues, leaving gaps through which escape the natural juices, nutriment, and flavor. So this goes back to what we were kind of discussing this last time.
Yeah.
So it does take place. Large ice crystals tear cell walls.
Okay. Real quick, tusks are like, they're made of the same stuff as teeth.
Okay.
Dentine.
That is definitely zinc.
Yeah. That's,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, they're rolling. They get ripped off the animal or broken off, and then they're rolling around on the bottom.
And they don't roll very well.
And then, of course,
especially a
the
mammoth
animal-
tusk has this huge curve. It doesn't roll.
Yeah, and the animal itself is going to be more buoyant.
Right.
So
Yes, and all the various bones.
are going to be inside the meat and stuff that carry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, they would. I can see how they could be sorted in that fashion.
Yeah.
Okay. Next mystery.
Teeth sink, folks.
How do I know this? I don't know. I just.
Okay, so Harris quotes one of Birdseye's engineers as saying, "Take poultry giblets. They can last 8 months at 10 below zero, but turn in 4 weeks above it. Or lobster lasts 24 months at 10 below, but less than 20 days at anything above that." So in the light of these statements, the description of the frozen mammoth flesh given by F.F. Hertz is very illuminating. Quoted by Bassett Digby in his book on the mammoth, Hertz said that, quote, "The flesh is fibrous and marbled with fat," unquote. "It looks as fresh as well-frozen beef." And this remark is made about flesh known to have been frozen for thousands of years. Some people have reported that they have been made ill by eating this preserved meat, but occasionally, at least, it really is perfectly edible. Thus, Joseph Barnes, former correspondent of the New York Herald Tribune, remarked on the delicious flavor of some mammoth meat served to him at a dinner at the Academy of Sciences in Moscow in the 1930s. So they found one that was perfectly preserved and
Oh, man.
cut some steaks.
That would be. I would do it. I'd try it.
Yeah. You just got to find the right one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Break time.
Wait. This is actually the end of the book report. So let me get to a stopping
Okay.
point here.
Yeah, we're already 10 minutes over. I forgot to. I wasn't watching the time. It's kind of behind me.
So what Birdseye proved was that meat, to remain in edible condition, must be kept very cold, not merely frozen, but at a temperature far below the freezing point. What the edible mammoth steaks proved was that the meat had been so kept, in at least a few cases, for perhaps 10 to 15,000 years in the Siberian tundra. So it is reasonable to suppose that the same cause that was responsible for the preservation of the meat also preserved the ivory, and therefore that tens or hundreds of thousands of animals were killed in the same way. How can such low temperatures for the original freeze be reconciled with the idea of individual accidents, unless at least the animals died in the middle of winter? It is quite certain that such temperatures could never have prevailed at the surface or in mud holes during spring freshets. Ripe seeds and buttercups found in the stomach of one of the mammoths, to be discussed later, showed that his death took place in the middle of the summer. It is obvious that during the summer, the temperatures at the top of the permafrost zone was and is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, or 0 degrees centigrade, neither more nor less, since by definition that is where melting begins. And from that point down, there would be only a relatively gradual fall in the prevailing temperature of the permafrost. Even if mammoths died in the winter, it is difficult to see how very many of them could become well enough buried to escape the warming effects of the thaws of thousands of springs and summers, which would have rotted both the meat and the ivory unless there was a change of climate. Okay, I think we can stop there.
15,000 summers. Still didn't thaw it out.
Yeah.
That's wild. All right, book report over for this week. We'll be right back with some other stuff.
Do you have other stuff?
I don't know.
Okay.
And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, for the final segment of the 271st Snake Bros episode. Path of the Pole, Part 8.
Yep.
Did we confirm
Part
that?
8
Okay.
is confirmed.
And,
We called the back office.
Yeah, that's now done. So we're in the intro segment.
Yeah, I still have thoughts on this. We're done with the book report for this episode, but I would just like to talk about the circumstances that these animals are in, and it's. I mean, I know most of you who listen to the show, most of you probably also listen to Randall, so a lot of this has been discussed, but I think that it's good to reiterate it. Like maybe we can sit here and just go over the circumstances and what is required to end up with what we have frozen in the tundra up there. So presumably you have a large number of megafaunal species and other stuff in a context where there's flowers, there's large trees with fruit. It's basically summer, maybe early fall, when a lot of these animals, at least the ones that are frozen with tissue, had died.
Yeah, it was October.
Yeah. So what does that mean when it comes to them not decomposing? In other words, you have to have an area that isn't Arctic that suddenly a whole bunch of animals die all at once. They get moved around by water and it picks up a bunch of trees and other material, deposits it all in a similar area, covers it in a bunch of sediment, and then that stuff freezes very quickly, and it never unfreezes.
Yeah, because
So you have to take an environment that's basically warm, and turn it cold and keep it that way forever.
this is another thing, like, the frost depth or the frost layer in a normal place, like a northern place that freezes and thaws
Yeah.
every year. There's a frost layer. Like, how deep does the ground actually freeze?
Yeah. That's right.
12 inches, 18 inches. And then,
Yeah.
it's pretty well known where people live because you got to put pipes down that low and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. So how deep are they digging down into this stuff and finding these bones? Is it 20 feet down? I mean, how
Yeah,
deep is this?
60
That's what I'm
feet.
saying. So it's not only the mass of the mammoth that you need to freeze from the outside all the way into the inside to preserve the stomach materials, but if it was buried
Yeah.
while it was still thawed,
Yeah.
what conditions could freeze something 20 feet down
Yeah.
that fast? Like, that's insane. It's hard to imagine that you went from a temperate climate to some catastrophe that caused this flood that's like jumbling everything up and freezing it at the same time while it's in motion. I mean,
Yeah.
but it gets 20 feet underground and and freezes in enough time to preserve the stuff in its
Right.
innards.
And once you have freezing conditions, you no longer have moving water.
Yeah.
So the water has to move and deposit and stop.
I mean, I guess it could be really freaking cold water that's moving so much it just can't solidify.
Can't solidify.
But
yeah.
still, how do you get that?
Yeah, does
that fast?
does mud freeze easier than water?
I don't think so. I don't think so. It's hard to imagine how it can be. Now, maybe there's not flesh that deep.
Yeah.
I don't know. Don't know enough about it, but at least any tissue 20 feet underground
Yeah.
that's preserved from freezing
Yeah.
is anomalous. Like, that's crazy.
Yes. And it is, I mean, again, you listen to this Rogan episode and the way the guy talks about it, there's just they're washing this stuff out of a huge cliff of frozen material.
Yeah, I got to see it. Did you watch it or just listen to it?
I just listened to it, yeah. But he has a
Goodness
bunch
me.
of pictures, and I guess there's a documentary I need to watch as well. He
Yeah.
said the Boneyard.
That's awesome.
But he just described it. He was like, look, this is how we do the gold mining. And he describes the process of gold mining, which is basically hydraulically washing away the tundra.
Yeah.
It's frozen
Yeah.
all the way down to the bedrock. And it's, you know, so you're talking about a lot of material. But that's Alaska, not Siberia, right? So these are two different areas. But still, it's...
Yeah, so they're not finding... Are they finding flesh there?
He said that there's sometimes organic material, yeah. Like, but they're not, like, fully fleshed. Like, you can't cut a steak.
Yeah.
But he says that people have found it, you know.
Probably
He
closer.
describes, and again, I don't want to give too many spoilers.
It's got to
but
be closer to the surface, though.
Yeah, maybe.
That's what I mean.
Maybe so. I don't know. But it's just, I mean, he describes eating mammoth at one point, not from his
Yeah.
boneyard, but yeah, and he was like, he was like,
It's got freezer burn.
Joe was like, well, how much did you? I mean, was it big? How much did you eat? He's like, a couple bites. He's like, really? That's it? He's like, that's all you want.
No.
Because it's not good.
Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, it's desiccated, right? It's been freeze burned or whatever, freezer
Yeah.
burned. It's dried out, but it's like jerky. I don't know.
You can survive on it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I'm just saying, the circumstances here.
Mix it with a little bug.
Yeah,
Be great.
mix in some cricket. Yeah, so it just seems. I just feel like the comet impact hypothesis doesn't quite give an adequate explanation of this. That's my gut feeling about it. Like, you know, that the impact cannot just explain why these Arctic areas were warm and then cold. Because it doesn't change the climate of those areas. It doesn't seem to, right? The comet impact is like, here's how we erase the ice sheet. You know, and it does seem to. Now I know there's an explanation of like, okay, it changes all the water flowing into the oceans. It changes some
It changes ocean currents, which changes, you know, jet stream currents and all that kind of stuff. And
but can that provide an explanation of?
they didn't have a polar vortex back then. The polar vortex just stayed way up there.
It
So
didn't,
they had-
didn't collapse and
Yeah, it
flow
didn't.
outward.
I don't know. I need to go back and listen to the earlier Path of the Pole episodes because I remember just being in this sort of midway position where it's like, well, there are certain aspects of this idea that I like that seem to explain stuff, but then other ones I'm just like, how? Like, it seems like we would know that there would be so much more evidence if the pole was actually moving around, oscillating around. Or, I mean, the crust is actually moving around and moving the polar region around the land masses,
Yeah.
almost as though, you know, how, like, for example, let's take a lake, and I'm not talking about any lake specifically, but if you could look at lake varves, and I don't know if we even have any, I mean, there's got to be lakes that are older than the Younger Dryas. Do we know of anywhere? Like, you would look at those and see if there were,
old are lakes? Yeah.
I don't know. Or maybe in the oceans, like sediments that go down where they can see, you know, like varves, annual lines that they can count,
Yeah.
that those would change over time or oscillate back and forth. I don't know. It's
I think he did talk about that. Remember the ancient rock bands that there's.
yeah, there's rock bands. That's right. That's what I'm saying. I need to go back and listen to them. It's been a while.
Yeah. I do feel like when I read it that I'm just like, okay, because he's saying, what is the trigger for this or that or whatever. And I'm like, we may have a trigger,
Yeah, for sure.
you know, and the trigger itself is catastrophic in nature. Right. And I'm not just talking about Younger Dryas. Any impact, if he's right that the crust can shift and that it's basically almost always in a state of just about to shift. That's kind of how he describes it. This is how I ended up picturing it. Is that it just quite hasn't overcome the coefficient of friction. Mm-hmm. But there's always all this stress on the crust because it's
Trying to
unevenly
move,
distributed. Yeah, distributed. So it wants to move, but it's being held in place. So you hit it with something, it's gonna move, right?
Right. And
so,
it's going to move too far.
right. Then yes, that's right.
It's always going to move too far. The pendulum always
Right,
swings
and
past the point of equilibrium.
Right, and what's interesting about that is that the end of the movement after moving too far is a slow down and stop, and then all that friction takes place again,
Yeah,
and then
it
it
just
freezes
locks
it
it in
into
there,
a
yeah.
place where it can't move again. Right, so this is possible that all it takes is an impact of some kind or a bombardment like the Comet Research Group is talking about, where it isn't one single bolide but a whole bunch of pieces. All it does is set up an oscillation in the crust from all these
Add enough
impacts and
energy to the
explosions.
system,
Enough
yeah.
energy, and then it starts to move. Because
It would explain why, like, in these legends where they're like, the sun stood still in the sky for
Yeah.
whatever, all that,
yeah,
I know that could also be a solstice
right, yeah,
metaphor, but there are just weird things about that. And, like, the sun rose in the west
yeah,
and set in the east. And it's like,
yeah.
man, I don't know.
Yeah, and if you happen to live in one of the areas where when the crust is shifting, you're basically on the pivot. In other words, so maybe you don't have a bunch of earthquakes and a whole
Right,
bunch of
right,
stuff,
right.
but like the sun just is moving
Yeah,
across
'cause
the
your
sky.
whole
You're
landscape
just
is
the
turning,
whole
yeah.
thing is turning. You're like, what is the deal? It's way over there,
Yeah.
right? And then eventually it stops, and now the sun rises over here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
But I feel like this frozen megafauna thing is a big mystery, and it still is a big mystery. Like there's at least there's people attempting to explain it at this point. But when Hapgood is dealing with it, he's you kind of when you're
And
reading
some of
through
these are like 40,000 years old, too.
Yeah.
So that's weird, right?
yeah.
We know we have something at 14,000 and
The other thing is the grouping of them on these islands reminds me of what animals do in floods. They'll all run to the highest point,
Yeah.
and they're all there,
yeah.
right? When we were going through Velikovsky, he's talking about that same phenomena, but also how there are caves just full
Yeah.
of just all these different kinds of animal bones.
Like they were taking refuge in there and
Yeah.
they just got blended.
and they just got blended in anyway, right?
yeah.
And not just caves, but huge like cracks, like or deep gulches or
right.
whatever, and they're just
stuffed in
filled
there.
with materials, like all these busted animals, bones and trees and stuff is just jammed in there and then locked in with the sediment, with the mud or the material and gravels. But in the case of these northern areas in Alaska and Siberia and in these islands up in the Arctic or whatever, it all this movement of water took place. And then it froze, and so it's still kind of in state, And it was just the description of all these geologists where they're like, okay, here's the composition. It's a very fine gray, silty stuff mixed with a bunch of water. In some cases, you find big lenses of ice, and they describe them specifically as lenses. Like there's an area of ice in there that's lens shaped, basically. So it's in a pocket. And then all this animal material plus huge masses of trees, all tangled, broken, busted, splintered, just all jammed together. So it seems like flood, but then you also have to have the freezing, and the freezing has to happen very quickly. So, and then it has to stay cold forever. But obviously, before all this happened, it wasn't cold. Or at least not that cold, right? Because you have plants that do not grow in Arctic conditions. And then Hapgood's pointing out on the Siberian islands, if you had very tall trees, you can't. That isn't even just about cold. It's about the fact that there's just no sunlight for half the year.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So that's what I'm saying. The Comet Research Group and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis doesn't quite explain the presence of large trees on Arctic islands.
Yeah.
The comet, a comet impact that breaks up the ice sheet and causes all this destruction doesn't change where the sun rises and sets. And doesn't change the fact that the Arctic Circle is in darkness for many months out of the year during the winter season, and thus you can't have a 90-foot fruit tree.
The other point about this,
Even if you had warm jet streams going up there, you just don't have enough sunlight.
yeah, that's for sure. You can't have that type of tree up there without
Yeah.
the sunlight. So that is a really good. That's a really good point for the shift. But also, if you accept this idea of this shift, it makes the solar, like coronal mass ejection idea kind of not make sense either. That might melt the ice sheets, but it doesn't seem like it would be something that would cause
Yeah.
like a mechanical vibration, like hitting the thing with a hammer that could get the crust moving.
Right. Now there is we have discussed previously on the show the idea of sunquakes. You know, how a big explosion on the sun can hammer the magnetic field, which translates into a mechanical vibration deep in the earth that sends out reverberations and results in earthquakes. Because somewhere, if the Earth's magnetic field is anchored to some physical object in it.
Yeah.
So just like if you have a magnet and you push another magnet at it, it translates into a physical, right? So if the sun sends out a huge magnetic pulse and it just hits the Earth's magnetic field, that could translate into quakes or, in other words, physical vibration on the planet.
That's a good point. It's just so
And maybe
it's like usually like in the crust, it's so dispersed. It's not. There's nothing really concentrated, magnetically. Mm-hmm. That would be in I don't know, but it's hard to imagine that.
We also don't know what is causing the magnetic field of the Earth. I mean, there's there are these ideas that it's hot metal moving fast around solid metal, something, right? But no one knows what it is really.
Right. It's just hard to imagine it like a fluctuating magnetic field is going to get the crust actually jumping around.
Right. It would have to. So if you just take the standard idea that at the center of the Earth there's a solid inner core of metal, basically nickel iron, and then a molten outer core of nickel iron that's flowing around it, and that's the dynamo that causes the magnetic field. And I know people say, well, you get iron above a certain temperature, it's no longer magnetic. Well, we're talking about iron under a lot of pressure.
I think that
it just has to be crystalline.
I think that there's I could be wrong about this, but I think that there are, it's not just, it's almost like absorption bands. You go up in temperature and then you lose magnetism and then you keep going up and it comes back.
Oh, okay.
I think that that's related to the mechanical vibration of the atoms and the molecules.
Themselves, yeah.
So
that's what I was saying.
As you go up in temperature, they change their frequency of vibration or whatever.
It has to have an ordered and crystalline structure, sort of, to have a magnetic field. That's what I thought.
Until you're, plasma.
Right.
Then it's it's like something completely different.
Right.
With a very, strong magnetic field.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the fusion process is yeah.
But I remember reading in some of, I think it was Tesla's patents when he was talking about it was a thermal generator, like a thermal, in other words, using fire to create electricity, right? Burning something to create electricity. And
a thermoelectric generator.
Yeah. Something like that. And he was talking about the temperature at which the iron or the steel or whatever loses its magnetism. But then it comes back. So that's where I was reading this, but I could look it up. I think it was around 600 degrees.
Well, I was just thinking that under great pressure, it doesn't matter how hot it is, as long as it's still solid and crystalline, it's going to have a magnetic field. But yeah, the point is that it could be solar, but I'm just saying that it seems to me at this point, maybe that the requirement here is both of these theories, that you have an impact of some kind, but you also have to have some kind of shift.
Yeah,
there's also the problem of the distribution of the ice.
And to be fair, the Comet Research Group is not trying to explain any of that other stuff.
That's right.
They're only talking about what was the energy input that caused the melting.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Well,
So here we go. 770 degrees Celsius, iron loses its magnetism.
okay.
Doesn't say that it comes back.
Oh, there you go. How is the Earth's? Somebody's asking the question on Reddit right there.
If iron loses its magnetism around 800 degrees C, how does it? Let's see. Yeah, I have to go. How is the Earth's core magnetic?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's under pressure, so it could
Yeah.
still possibly have like a.
It's
more
under an
ordered
enormous
structure.
amount of pressure. Yeah.
Anyways,
All right. Well,
do some emails.
let's, we'll do Space Weather News and all that other stuff.
Yeah. I got one button to push.
Yeah, one button. It doesn't work. Space Weather News.
Hold on a second. How dare you not work?
There you go.
You in your studio?
All right. Space Weather News from spaceweather.com. A geomagnetic storm watch, a minor G1 class geomagnetic storm, is possible on January 4th and 5th when a slow-moving CME is expected to hit Earth's magnetic field. It was hurled in our direction by an M3.7 class solar flare. Also, there was a far side solar explosion. This morning, January 3rd, something exploded on the far side of the sun. The Solar and Heliospheric Observatory recorded a bright CME billowing over the sun's southeastern limb. The source of the blast was probably old sunspot AR3163, which has spent the last 2 weeks transiting the far side. It is due to return on January 4th. Helioseismic echoes suggest that the sunspot has grown since we last saw it in December. It may present a threat for significant Earth-directed flares after it reappears tomorrow. Current conditions, solar wind speed. Ooh.
Do all these flares, is there a specific time at which the flares move around? Or are they moving along with the rotation?
I think the rotation, yeah.
They're just due to rotation.
I think so. I don't know if they're like in
They're also moving.
in subjective motion, yeah.
Like storms on Earth are moving, but they're also
yeah.
rotating
They're
because
being
of the
rotated,
Earth.
yeah. I think that they are just due to solar rotation, which is
Okay.
how they can very precisely predict when they're going to show
Okay.
back up. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do move around. I don't know. Solar wind speed is 446.0 kilometers per second. The density is 5.17 protons per cubic centimeter. Sunspot number is 89. Neutron count is 2.8% above the space age average, and the KP index is 4, unsettled, and the 24-hour max is also 4. I want to see a stormy KP index. Give me an 8 here.
Space weather news takes a while, folks. It's mostly calm.
It is very calm most of the
Yeah.
time, except for, 400 something kilometer per second winds
Yeah,
all
yeah.
the time. Put your windmill up in
Got
that.
a big sail
Yeah.
for that.
So what about ag? We got ag updates. We got we're back at the farm. What are you doing?
Yeah, well, I was just getting back into the swing of things. I was the only person at work for a couple weeks. It was amazing. But
Yeah, I took my
Then
2-week vacation after we got back
Yeah.
from Egypt.
then we had the holidays, so then I was like back to partying, drinking beers, hanging out, working on the studio. Really, I was working the whole time, but at home. And now I'm back again. So I had to go. It's just like, all right, here we go again.
Here we go again. Got to get back into it. Yeah, I know. After all of Egypt and then 2 weeks of vacation, I'm like, I do not want to go back to work.
That's why I'm like, redo the studio. Like, let's kick some ass here so that this is all we ever have to do.
Yes, that's what we want.
I just want to be in here. And, traveling the world and doing cool stuff.
Yeah.
Of course. Amazing dream.
Impossible dream.
Impossible dream. Potatoes. So I'm just working on wine stuff. Really, just trying to get things lined out for bottling. It's kind of slow season.
Yeah.
We're gonna start pruning.
Yep.
Pretty soon here. We've had a nice deep freeze, so everything is very dormant. And then we'll be able to do our pruning here in a few weeks. And into February. And then I've got to install a new section to the vineyard, 500 grapes going up on these terraces with a cap rock. I got to drill 500 holes into.
Oh, really?
the
I thought
limestone
we were
rock.
done expanding.
No, we got 500 Alicante Boucher.
I thought that last expansion was the last one.
This is a small expansion.
Okay.
The last one was 7,000 vines. This one's 500.
Yeah.
It was part of the initial.
Oh, they were going to be the
expansion, but
head. They were going to be the. Okay.
It didn't work. Yeah, the head trained ones.
Head trained ones.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we couldn't get it done. So we're doing it this year.
So
So
we're
that's
going to be
coming.
up there with an auger drilling a bunch of holes. Is that the deal?
I might just get a contractor to do it. I don't
Yeah.
want to do that.
Yeah.
500 holes. with a
500 holes. Yeah. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear grapevines
What
have
we
some
have
rock.
to do is go up there and survey it and lay out the grid
Yeah.
on this hillside,
Yeah.
which is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
I've already got trenches dug. I'm ready to run water line. So
Okay.
that's what I've been doing. Built a dock.
Yep.
Purchased a dock from Montana on a pallet. It's beautiful. I assembled it, floated it out there. I'm like, man, this is great. I recommend this dock company.
Hello, state in the middle of the continent. I need a water thing.
They have a bunch of lakes.
Yeah, they do have lakes. I know.
Yeah. I was like, man, I was looking up dock companies. They're all over, calling all these people, trying to get a dock. And they kept, I kept getting these quotes that were outrageous. And then I got this quote from this company that was half what everybody else was quoting me. And I'm like, done.
Yeah.
And then it shows up on this pallet. It was beautifully engineered and designed, and I was able to assemble it all very easily. It was, it was great.
Yeah. So the idea is we have a pump in this pond and he wants to float it instead of having it sitting
Yeah,
in
I don't want
silty
it
bottom.
yeah.
Yeah. Which is a great idea. So we got a floating dock and the pump will just hang off of it.
Yeah,
right?
and I got the dock long enough to go out to the deepest part of the pond, so we
Yeah.
can suck that thing dry if we need to.
Yeah.
Almost. And that'll solve all my irrigation problems. I hope.
You hope.
Until a Texas major flood comes through, and then that's the other thing I'm worried about is like, how do I prevent this dock from being torn to pieces?
No,
in a
right. Yeah.
flood?
Yeah. In a flood. Yep.
Anyways, y'all don't want to hear about that. Just
What else?
problems, things trying to solve at work.
Rock and roll. You got to rock and roll?
Dude, I've been working on music every day.
Yeah. Okay.
I've written. I'm writing more stuff. I'm writing lyrics. I had Daniel over the holidays. He stayed. He's got 2 boys, and so they were playing with Soul and Lila, and we were just hanging out. And I was working on this studio. And then when I finally got all the equipment set up, I was just like, dude, let's get in there. So we recorded some stuff, and I was just going through all these songs that I have on this computer. From I have old computer,
Yeah.
old $50 Dynasty drive, really old computer. I have all these old computer hard drives that I've just put on the RAID stack,
Yeah.
all with these songs. And I've got stuff going way back, and I'm just going through and listening to all this stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is trash. This is also trash. Ooh,
Yeah.
this is cool. So I'm just really just working on it every day. I've been bouncing things out, and I'm listening to it at work, and writing lyrics, playing guitar when I can. So, yeah, I'm just really enjoying working on the music, and I've got some good stuff going
That's
for the
good.
blues album. The next album is going to be bluesy.
Blues. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a totally different vibe than Procession.
Of course. Yeah. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, bunch of love songs. with weird, snaky, subtle ideas embedded in there.
Yeah, of course.
And in fact, a lot of it starts out with this weird, sciencey, nerdy, snaky idea, and then I manipulate the lyrics into, a love song.
Yeah.
And it's great.
Right.
It's freaking cool.
Check out my pyramid, baby. I got pyramids all the time.
Yep.
All right. Well,
That's straight from one of the songs. I just wrote that line. I showed it to Russ when he got in the studio.
all right. Well, I mean, we're time's up.
Dang,
Time is
we
up.
didn't even get to the emails.
That's okay.
Give us one.
We got emails. We can do emails anytime. We just did a whole
Well, then
listener
let's do
communication episode. No. We're done. I think we're I know people, everybody's down on crypto right now because of stuff happening, but I'm still going to keep up with some crypto updates, at least for Bitcoin and Ethereum. Unless the entire market collapses, and then then we can stop. But for now,
Crypto is zero.
yeah.
End of crypto updates.
End of crypto updates. So Bitcoin, by the way, where is the dingy thingy?
Ooh. I did not. Oh, nope. It's in the knickknacks box, which I didn't bring.
Okay.
And have you noticed?
Yeah, knickknacks are all gone.
That's the only knickknack we
Yeah.
got. It's,
We need our one knickknack in the dinghy thingy.
I'm not done yet. I said it
course.
was show ready.
Of course,
I didn't say
yeah.
it was done.
So
Jesus.
BTC is
Chance.
currently $16,844.97, and ETH Ethereum is $1,248.84. And that is your crypto update and your Snake Bros podcast for the week.
I hope that shit bottoms out right when Laura sells a giant ranch.
Oh yeah, just buy a bunch of Bitcoin for 1 cent per coin.
Yeah. All right. That was good fun.
Yeah.
Always, there's a lot of stuff to learn from this book, and I every episode I'm just like, wow, it always gets me thinking about stuff.
Yep.
It's a great book.
Yeah.
So thanks for
And
bringing it to the table.
there's
buddy.
much more to come in this chapter 10 on the megafauna extinctions. I've gone through the whole chapter, and it's fantastic. So
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I also want to mention the Cosmic Summit. You guys should go to that. We haven't talked about it, but our old
Cosmic
buddy,
Summit 2023.
yeah, our buddy George Howard is throwing this event, and we're involved. And it's Saturday and Sunday, June 17th and 18th at the Crown Plaza Resort in Asheville, North Carolina. So we're gonna be there.
Yep.
Randall, Graham, Ben, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. So
It will.
I will be sweeping floors and making sure the beers are cold. Russ is doing a presentation.
Whatever. Kyle's setting up the stage, and he's handling the production. But he's also going to be sweeping the floors.
Yep.
So
That's what I told George.
yeah, we're going to give him a janitor outfit so he can. Like Kyle is the custodian.
Make sure those beers are ice cold, people. You should come hang out. All right. Thanks everybody for all the donations. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all you patrons supporting the podcast. Can't thank you enough.
Yeah.
It's been an amazing journey.
Annabelle is a producer this week.
That's right. $70.
$70. Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was actually not this week. It was a while back, but I realized that there was 2 donations, one right after the other, and I was like, oh,
Yeah, that makes
that's
her
a producer donation.
Yeah. So she's associate executive producer for that, or is she executive producer?
Well, we should just give her executive producer because she also gave us hand-carved spoons.
That's right. We did get very nice hand-carved wooden spoons.
which Laura loves. by
Okay,
the way.
good.
So thank you, Annabelle.
Yeah, so executive producer for this episode. Thank you. Thank you very much. She was on the Egypt trip with us.
Yeah.
So, all right, I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much. We love you.
Always have.
Always will.
Good night, Adamu.
Get back to work.